Working the night shift can be terrifying for many different reasons, especially if you're scared of the dark. For now though, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. So, my dad is a career firefighter back home, and he told me this story. Station 2 in his area is allegedly supremely haunted, and I tend to believe him because I have never actually seen my dad scared before until he came home from his shift that day. So, they had just a normal medical run at around 1 AM. Dad was the treating EMT for the run, and so, when they got back at around 3:30 AM, he went into the computer room to write up the run report as is procedure. He sat down at the computer and said he immediately had an uneasy feeling, like someone was there. He thought maybe one of the guys had come downstairs from the bunk room to find out what he was doing. So he turned around to walk out into the day room and see who it was. When he turned around, he saw a man in a black top hat standing outside the window. The man turned and walked towards the front door. Thinking somebody was there for something, since it's technically a safe place, my dad jumped up and ran out the front door to find the guy. But he was gone. But as my dad went to walk back into the station, the man walked around the corner and through the front door of the station. Didn't open the door though. Which would have been impossible, since the door is locked and requires a numerical code to open. He walked through the door and disappeared. My dad said he immediately went up to the bunk room and finished the report in the morning, because he was so freaked out. The second story is from the same station, and it scares the living crap out of me. This guy is a no-nonsense, cut-the-bullshit mountain of a man. I have never seen in my life a smile, and yet I have known him for almost 15 years now. Him telling me this story was the first time I'd ever seen him show any form of emotion. All the guys were hanging around the day room telling ghost stories, and this guy told them all he didn't believe a word of it, and they dared him to stay downstairs well after everyone had gone to bed to prove it was all bullshit. So he does. He stays up until around 2 AM. He turns off the last lights and starts up the stairs when he hears a woman whisper in his ear, "He's finally going to bed." The only woman on the department was not on shift at the time, and everyone else was in bed. He swears up and down that it happened, and all the guys said he looked absolutely terrified. And he looked terrified just telling me that story. There is a lot of weird shit that happens in that station. When I was 18, I briefly worked nights as a care assistant in a nursing home. The building was a very old ex-convent and was pretty spooky at the best of times. There were 3 floors, but I was only ever working on the ground and first floors. One day, about 2 weeks in, I was sent up to the top floor to get something. It was my first time up there, and for the first time, it occurred to me how odd it was that I'd never worked up there before, or seen any patients who lived up there. So I'm walking along the main corridor, which is pretty narrow and twisty. Being a night shift, we keep the lights on emergency setting, which is very dim and on motion sensors, so that the residents can sleep peacefully. Suddenly, at the other end of the corridor, I see this dark shape. It looked like the Grim Reaper, with a dark cowl and long robes, and was even holding what appeared to be some kind of scythe, and it was moving slowly towards me. I knew that it wasn't a resident, as most of our residents were not ambulatory, and I was pretty sure none of them dressed in dark robes. So I did the logical thing. I turned without even thinking about it and sprinted back down to the first floor, where I managed to convey through panicky gestures that there was some kind of terrifying monster on the top floor. After about 5 minutes, my co-workers stopped cracking up and explained my mistake to me. You know how I mentioned that the house used to be a convent? Well, apparently, part of the deal was the remaining nuns, who were all pretty old by now, got to continue living on the top floor without nursing care and use the facilities of the home, like cook meals. And not a single person had thought to mention this to me. If I'd worked days, I would have seen them up and about. But the 8 PM to 6 AM night shift at a nursing home is pretty quiet. The shape I had seen was actually an elderly nun, in robes and a head covering, with a crutch, heading down the corridor to their little chapel as she couldn't sleep. And not, as I had for some reason assumed, the Grim Reaper here to collect one of our residents. I switched off night shifts soon after that. I work night shifts in an emergency department. Creepy doesn't even begin to suffice to describe the shit that I see. Night brings out the underworld. Drugs, alcohol, sex, you name it. People seek it under the cover of night. I've taken care of rape victims, people high on PCP, prostitutes whose jong got a little too rough, to the random white-collar Fortune 500 dude with a 16-inch dildo stuck in an orifice where it shouldn't be. And that is just another night in the department. I once took care of 2 people involved in a robbery. One was the victim and one was the robber. Simple, right? Well, the victim was beaten with a pipe so badly, the bones in his face were basically mush. He needed major surgery and I believe had bleeding in his brain. I primarily took care of the thug who robbed him. While he was sitting there with the cops, he described in detail to me how much he loved seeing that man's face cave in, how much he loved killing him. I have never experienced someone so sober, so cold, describe in explicit detail how much they enjoyed attempting to murder someone. To give you an idea of what I was looking at, the blood that was all over this man was not his, as he did not have a single injury that we could find. The man was brought into the ER to be cleared for jail, Then about an hour later, a drunk college kid took a shit on the floor, and then I made him clean it up. About 7 years ago, I was working on a piece of software at my company, which had camera recording functionality. But because of the platform and length of the recording, it was actually taking stills every dozen or so seconds for a stop-motion film sort of thing. Anyway, one night I leave it going to ensure that it can 1. Record its maximum length, and 2. Remain stable over long periods of time. So in the morning, I get in and sit down and review last night's footage for quality and stability's sake. Quiet and still office with lights on and a couple of people. People leave. Lights turn off. Darkness, darkness, darkness. But there is a faint light from the outside coming in through the window. I see something in the office move. I start to go back and forth between frames when the lights went off and when they came back on. It seems a chair had turned, all before anyone came in. I sat there and reviewed the footage for a bit before talking with my supervisor, who informed me that the last shift last night ended at around 9 p.m. No one had entered the office between 9 and 6. I shrugged it off and continued my daily work. But before I left for the night, I left the camera recording once more. Coming in the next day, I reviewed the footage, and again, a chair or two had been turned. I told my supervisor again, who again assured me that no one was in last night, but now he too was curious, and asked around and was told absolutely no one was in the office at night. So now, my supervisor asked me to leave the camera recording each night, and every morning when we came in to review the footage showed us chairs moved and turned. Some chairs had even moved a few feet. So, on one of the last nights of us using this software, we pointed directly at the row where the chairs kept moving. Then, with there being no night shifts that night, we pulled all the chairs to the front of the row to see where they would be the next day. When we came in the next morning, it was evident that they had been moved, as some had been turned and one had been rolled back against the wall, roughly 20 feet from where we left it. Reviewing the camera footage showed nothing moved smoothly, as it was 12-second frames. Only a set of chairs in a cluster, and then a set of turned and slightly moved chairs, and one single chair 20 feet away from the others. We never got a good explanation. We checked with all departments and the cleaning crew. No one had a reply that backed up why the chairs would move by themselves overnight. It was a winter night in 1980 in Santa Clara, California. A friend of mine, Scott, worked at a small all-night gas station, sitting in a little booth, selling only gas and cigarettes made for a lot of quiet nights. I had just recently started a new security company with an associate I had worked with at another company. I was in charge of running the security patrols every night, stopping 3 times a night at our customers' properties. Using my own car, I covered an area 3 city-wide. I would stop where Scott worked between patrols to keep him company, and just pass the time till I needed to patrol my customers again. It was a nice night, not too cold, but not cold enough for a jacket. It was my second visit to see Scott that night. It was around 3 o'clock in the morning, and the night was unusually quiet. There was no traffic on the road, which was kind of unusual since the police department was just down the road. It was not uncommon to see police cars coming and going now and then, but not tonight. I was parked next to the booth, and we decided to smoke a joint since it was quiet. Afterwards, Scott went back in the booth, and I was sat in my car and we continued talking. From out of nowhere, a very thick fog rolled in and surrounded the station. We commented on how thick and unusual it was. We couldn't see the traffic lights that were only 15 yards from the station. Fog that thick wasn't normal in Santa Clara and was an eerie feeling, but was kind of cool. We both glanced towards the strip mall next to the station. From out of the fog, the silhouette of a guy appeared walking towards us. The closer he got, we saw he was a young guy. He was kind of odd looking and had a guitar slung over his back. Scott closed the door to the booth, while I, being an armed security officer, remained in my car as he came up to both of us. He asked if either of us had a cigarette. We said no, and he started talking about things that really made no sense. Scott and I exchanged looks as if to say, "Not again." Over the years, Scott and I had seen some strange things. Most were kind of funny, some were just bizarre, but for us it wasn't unusual for strange things to happen. The fog was still as thick as ever. No sound of traffic could be heard, and nothing past the canopy of the station could be seen. We were wondering why this guy was just hanging around. He seemed harmless, but was just a bit off, if you know what I mean. Finally tired of him, Scott started to read his book, ignoring him. I, not wanting to leave Scott alone with this guy, went to the trunk of my car. I pulled out my drum pad and sticks and placed them on the trunk lid. I had started doing some warm-up exercises, hoping to maybe chase the guy off. Instead, the guy started watching. He started clapping his hands in something other than a musical rhythm, and I just tried to ignore him. I kept practicing when he finally said, "Let's jam." I started a long roll as he turned his guitar around and started strumming. His guitar was not only out of tune, but had 3 strings. He kept strumming when I stopped mid-roll and stared at him and told him, "Never interrupt a musician while he's practicing," and continued the long roll. He looked at me and said, "Well, if you're gonna be like that, c'est la vie." I once again stopped mid-roll and looked him in the eye and said, "C'est la vie." He slung his guitar on his back and started walking in the way he came. Scott and I looked over each other with a sigh of relief. We thought he would never leave. The guy had no sooner vanished into the thick fog, when the fog rolled away as fast as it rolled in. Scott and I looked towards where the guy had walked off to. We wanted to make sure he kept going, but as we looked down the long, straight mall walkway, there was no one to be seen. The guy had vanished with the strange fog. Scott and I were dumbfounded, and there was no place he could have hidden, and even at a dead run, could not have covered that much ground that fast. We knew he was there, as was the fog. Now both had just disappeared. We both looked at each other and just knew we had just been to the Twilight Zone. I left to do my last patrol, and Scott went back to his booth. As I left, I noticed the traffic was back to normal, and I drove down the street and kept a lookout for our friend, but he was nowhere to be seen. Neither him or the fog ever appeared again. A few years ago, I worked the night shift at a hotel. It wasn't super fancy, but it wasn't a seedy motel or anything either, and it was in a decent area of town. It was geared for extended stay guests, who were mostly there for work. There were not a lot of late arrivals, so it was a pretty nice gig. I got paid to just kick in the back room and listen to YouTube until the sun came up, which is what I was doing with my nights anyway. After midnight, we locked the front doors. If someone sounded the buzzer, I would open the doors manually to let them in. One night, at around 1 in the morning, a young woman ran up and began pounding on the front doors. She was screaming at the top of her lungs, "Please help me, open the doors, please don't let them get me." Shit like that. So I opened the door for her and grabbed the phone and punched 911. She sprinted in, and I just watched the doors behind her close. Agonizingly slow. Positive that her attackers would slip in before the automatic doors closed and locked again. But no one came. She kept babbling, telling me to call the police. "Call the police, please. You can't let them in," is what she kept saying. Which freaked me out more than anything. I was already calling the police, of course, and I told her as much. But this didn't seem to calm her down. I informed the police of the situation, and they immediately asked me if she had gotten out of any specific taxi. I didn't know if she had or not, and they said that they were sending some officers over. After I got off the phone, she was a little calmer, but she kept looking frantically around the lobby. I tried to assure her that everything would be fine, but it didn't seem like she heard a word I said. She started to wander off down the hall, so I followed her. She went into our large conference and breakfast room, where she backed herself into a corner, now staring directly at me with increasing terror. I kept telling her everything was alright, and I did not approach her. I just wanted her in sight, but I had no desire to get close. I tried asking her what happened, but she would not respond. She just kept telling me I had to help her, and that she was afraid that they would get her. I told her it was okay, and that the police had been called. She looked horrified at that, and asked me why I called the cops on her. I explained I had called the cops for her, not on her, and that the police would be there to keep her safe. To which she responded, "Don't bloody touch me." I was roughly 50 feet away from her and hadn't moved at all. It was about then that my fears started to ease up, because I realized there probably wasn't a them after all, and this girl was simply having some sort of mental break, probably drug-related. The cops arrived shortly after, and rather than being relieved, she was scared of them and was reluctant to speak. They sat her in a chair in the lobby and tried to ask her name, but she drew up her knees to her chest and started hyperventilating. Then she got up and speed-walked down the hall. The cops ended up escorting her out the building. She wasn't struggling or screaming, but she definitely seemed distraught and confused. When it was all said and done, I reviewed the security footage from outside the hotel, and it looked like she'd taken a taxi ride to the hotel. Then she had bailed out when it slowed down for the stoplight, and then she'd come running into our front door screaming. At no point was she pursued by anyone or anything. From what the police told me, the cab driver called the police before I did, and since she had skipped out on the fare. I never knew what happened to her after that. I didn't get to see the arrest reports, so I don't think they charged her with anything. I just hope they were able to get her somewhere safe. I work for a uniform rental company, or at least I did, running the washers and the dryers. It was a pretty easy gig. I'd been there for 2 years, and Friday was my final shift. I got a transfer to the service department, which I am starting tonight. My shift in production ran from 12 to 9 a.m, and I'd take my first break at around 2 in the morning. Only once, in the 2 years that I had been there, had something ever creeped me out. I go to take my break, handing off running the machines to our maintenance guy, as I walked out into the main production floor. I have to cross this huge area covered with tight aisles of uniform. As I'm walking, I get the feeling like I'm being watched. I felt my neck and arms break out in goosebumps, and I get this stupidly random thought. Don't look to the left or right. Eyes locked forward and pretending nothing's wrong. It was a stupid thought that got a grip on me enough to make me abide it. I walked straight and didn't look left nor right, across the production floor and on into the break room and outside for a smoke. Immediately, the tension disappeared. I thought it would get worse, considering I was walking out into the dark. But no. It melted away like butter, and I calmly sat out in the night, puffing away and telling myself I was being crazy. Every ounce of dread I had walking through the plant was gone, and I chalked it up to an overactive imagination. Until my break was over, I walked back into the plant, and it hit me again, like a goddamn wall. Every animal instinct I possessed was screaming that something was watching me, and whatever it was didn't like me and wanted me out. The goosebumps came back doubled. My face broke out. The only thing I can equate is that it's like if you get a bad sunburn and your skin starts to feel too tight. By the time I got back to my work area, I was shaking. I don't believe in the supernatural. At least I didn't. But at this point, I couldn't think of anything that would explain that active malevolence that followed me through the plant. I even asked the maintenance dude if he felt anything strange, and he just gave a stupid look, so I dropped it. In my work area, I was fine. There were about 8 other people on the night shift, and around them, everything was relaxed. But the moment I walked over to the main plant area alone to unload clothes from the conveyor belt, I got that creepy dread, and I'd hurry along back to the others. After a few hours, I was good. The feeling went away. Whatever evil I was experiencing went away, or at least turned its attention elsewhere. At around 7 in the morning, I found out what the evil was. A cat. By this time, the day shift had come in, and when I ran the conveyor belt, a cat tore out like a bat out of hell. He must have jumped the fence, come through the bay doors, and hid in the plant proper. We'd see cats outside all the time, so it's not really surprising one would get in. But damn, being stalked by one, I really felt it. I work overnights as a nurse in an ICU. Sometimes, when a patient passes, they hang around for a little while. We have a call bell system where you press a button in your room and a phone at the desk tells us which room needs help. It's also linked to our staff emergency button and a code blue button. In the last 2 days, we've had 2 patients die, and the call bell for room 7 just won't shut up. It's ringing constantly, all day and night long. Maintenance unplugged something from the wall, and it's still ringing, except it rings to the other floors. I told the ghost that it had died, and it needed to move on. Now it only rings when I'm in the room. Creepy as hell. There's a lot of ghost stories in hospitals, and I wish our windows opened so that we could light some sage and cleanse it out or something. As it is now, we can't put a patient in that room until that shit stops. I have 3 stories. A couple of paranormal things, and a totally normal creepy thing. I work at a hotel. One morning at around 4 a.m, when I was preparing the complimentary coffee bar, I spotted a figure in the kitchen, right next to the door. 6'5", almost entirely immersed in shadow. That entire area is employees only. So, I got ready to chase the bastard out of there. Then, he lifts his leg at the knee and floats silently out. I didn't fully comprehend what I had just seen, so I still ran back there, but no one was there. On another morning, I was looking down at the computer monitor. There are a few very large faux wood pillars in our lobby. I saw a lady in a cream dress walk out of the ground floor elevator, walk towards me, and as I looked up to greet her, she stepped behind the pillar closest to me. I waited for her to step out onto the other side, but she didn't. So I walked around looking for her, but she was gone. In hindsight, I never did hear the elevators or any of the other side doors open. The final story. This guy, in a baggy black hoodie and jeans and hat, comes out of the elevator. He starts mumbling something as he's walking towards me, and he has a knife in his hand. It's one of our steak knives from the restaurant. He's gripping it tightly and coming towards me very slowly. I'm just trying to figure out what he's going to do before I react. But as he gets within about 3 feet of the desk, he gingerly holds the knife out to me across both hands, offering it to me. He's apologizing for accidentally taking it upstairs. He didn't even realize he still had it and wanted to give it back. So I carefully took it, thanked him, and carried it to the kitchen while he went outside. He never came back in. He waved and said, "Night-night." It was kind of sweet actually, after the initial fear of course. I was working in a big resort in Greece, where we had 4 hotels located in the resort. I was working in one of the smallest of the 4 hotels, where usually, at night, there are only 2 people working. Myself, the groom, and the receptionist. One night, it was ridiculously misty. Maybe happened 3 times whilst I was working there. I was just standing around the driveway when I noticed someone approaching from the gate at around 4 a.m. Nothing out of the ordinary, but as the person gets closer, I notice it was an old lady in a white nightgown, wearing nothing else and walking bare feet. This literally looked like the scene straight from a horror movie. I kind of froze for a second and thought to myself that I had fallen asleep on shift or someone was pulling a prank. But sure enough, the lady comes closer, with a blank expression on her face, feet completely muddy and scratched up. I slowly walked up to her to ask if she were okay, fully expecting her to jump and choke me to death and bite my face off. As she got closer, I could see she was really confused and didn't really know where she was. I tried to ask her if she knows which hotel she's staying at and asked her name, but she couldn't remember where she was staying or what her room number was. So I went inside into the reception, where my colleague is also doing a double take on this lady and looking at me with some sort of expression like, where the hell did I find this thing? After a few minutes of searching with the names she was giving us and calling the other hotels, we found a family with a similar last name that she'd been giving us. She was really confused and was giving us many names in one of the other properties. So I got the longest golf cart we had on the property, put her in the furthest seat in the back just in case she decides to go all zombie mode and take a nice bite out of my neck, and off we went to the hotel, with myself constantly looking behind my shoulder like a paranoid 20-year-old every 200 meters. Turns out, the old lady was on holiday with her family, and she was suffering from Alzheimer's. They think she kinda sleepwalked out of her room, and then got lost and confused after that. The mind is a very scary and dangerous thing. So, a little bit of background information first. I work swing shift as a security guard during the daylight hours. I'm inside monitoring cameras, but once it gets dark, I'm outside patrolling the property. The building I work at is in a pretty developed area, but it's a pretty large property with multiple large parking lots, so there's a lot of ground to cover on patrol. Even at night, there's generally a lot of activity beyond our fences, be it vehicle traffic or the occasional drunk homeless man. It's almost never quiet in the time that I've worked here. Until a windy Saturday night a couple of weeks ago. I was nearing the end of my shift and only had about 30 minutes to go until my relief arrived, and I could go home. I was patrolling near a small wooded area at the southernmost edge of the property, when all of a sudden, everything seemed a little bit off. I looked around, and there wasn't a car or person in sight, be it on the road outside the property or in the south parking lot. That's never happened before. As I continued my patrol, I noticed that the wind had died down entirely, and that the entire place was silent. Even the normally annoying birds in the trees were not squawking. It was just so weirdly quiet. I looked around me, and I didn't see anything. And that's when I decided to look up. In the sky above me was what I now believe to be a UFO, or multiple UFOs. At first, I thought that it might be a satellite, but it wasn't moving in a straight orbital pattern. Then I thought it might be a plane from a nearby airport or a helicopter, but it just didn't seem right. It had several lights, which were alternating in color in unison. A light would be bright blue, then switch to neon green, while another would switch to bright blue. It was mesmerizing, really. The way it was moving was mind-boggling. It would go forward, then immediately be at a dead stop, then backwards, then sideways, then diagonal. It made no sense. Then, as I was staring at it, it disappeared. No flying away, no zipping into space in the blink of an eye. It's like it just turned off the lights. Wherever it was, I couldn't see it. I went inside and sat down for a few minutes and then went home. I'm still weirded out by that experience. I work in the emergency services. One night, I picked up on the night shift. We get a call from an unknown condition at an address that gets changed like 5 times before we're flagged down in front of a huge Masonic temple by a frantic woman. She tells us that her boyfriend is the custodian and is in charge of locking up every night. He texted her over an hour ago, saying that he had crushing chest pain and shortness of breath, and now he's not answering his texts. The door is locked, but she knows he's inside because his car is there, and there are lights on inside. The huge wooden doors are locked, so we call for the firefighters to break them down. It takes about 20 minutes of smashing a 12-foot tall wooden door off its hinges, and once we make entry, it's pretty spooky. I don't know if anyone has ever been in a Masonic temple before, but they're scary as shit with all the lights off. Marble floors and columns, lots of velvet curtains, and no light switches to be found. Me, my partner, the girlfriend, and 5 firemen start searching the place room by room, floor by floor. In all honesty, we are totally expecting to find a corpse, and possibly a ghost or two. We clear the first floor and start up the stairs. An interesting thing about Masonic temples is that they tend to get stranger the higher you go in them. By the 3rd floor, they are all freaking us the hell out, and we're jumping at shadows. Somehow, we push onwards onto the 5th and final floor. At this point, there's a huge spooky chandelier with weird symbols painted everywhere, and even the firefighter, lieutenant, is getting freaked out. The top floor consists of a big room with a long hallway leading off it. All the way down the pitch black hallway, we can see a door that has the lights on behind it. We slowly creep towards it, none of us wanting to be the first in line. Eventually, we reach the doorway after a solid minute of silently miming who should open the door. My partner and I agree to do it together. We take a couple of deep breaths, silently count to 3, and throw the doors open. As our eyes adjust to the light, we see a middle-aged man jump up from a desk, rip his headphones off, and frantically try to turn off the super hardcore porn he's been watching. He apparently had texted his girlfriend saying he had a burrito for dinner and it didn't quite agree with him, and she had wildly misunderstood his text. As we all fled the building, we could still hear the couple arguing as he began to wonder how we'd gotten into the building and who would compensate them for the door. I worked in a home-like facility for the elders. I had a woman who liked to wander a lot in the nights, and I had to keep her out of the other residents' rooms. One overnight shift, I was sitting on a couch at the front of the facility. I had a clear, straight view down the hallway. I saw what I thought was the wandering woman go into a room that wasn't hers. I quickly got up from the couch, walked straight down the dark hallway, and peeked into the bedroom that I saw her walk into. The only resident in that room was the one that belonged there, sleeping on the bed. I went to the wandering resident's room and found her still asleep in her own bed as well. I immediately knew I must have seen a ghost. Although I acknowledged it, I was still shaken. I sat back down on the couch and stared down the hallway for most of the night, not really wanting to move. My shift ended, and I went home to sleep for the day. Upon returning from my shift next evening, I was informed that the resident, in which I thought I saw someone going into the room of, had died suddenly during mid-morning. I was a little unsettled, but had to recognize that maybe one of her loved ones on the other side was there to collect her when she was ready. Working with death often, you're privy to these types of things sometimes. Some of them more nerve-wracking than others. 19 hours later, while working around 2 or 3 in the morning, I was standing in the middle of a living room that is lined with bookshelves on one side of the room. I was thinking about a particular resident that actually did not take a liking to me. The resident had passed away about 6 months previously. At the moment I was thinking about said patient, a book falls off the bookshelf. The book literally came off the shelf and landed on the floor about 6 feet away. I am convinced that place is haunted. I was working as a security guard one night at the local high school pool. A friend drove by to bring me some lunch around 2 a.m. He stayed for a bit, and we were just shooting the shit in the parking lot while I ate my food. Then all of a sudden, in the dead silence of the night, there was a big splash from the pool behind us, like a large person doing a cannonball off the high dive. We both looked at each other surprised. I immediately took off running towards the pool, through the parking lot, and around a small structure that served as an admin building. I was ready to catch my first perpetrator ever, figuring it was just some troublemaking kids. I rounded the corner, and I couldn't believe what I saw. Nothing. There was no sign it ever happened. The water was completely still. The concrete around it was dry, and there wasn't a person in sight. Not to mention, the pool was surrounded by an 8-foot iron fence, so there's no way for a quick getaway. It wouldn't have taken me more than 15 seconds to reach the pool from where I was standing. I've never believed in ghosts, but that was definitely the creepiest thing I've ever seen and heard. I used to work the overnight shift for a few years. I've seen some shit. The hotel I work at is a great place, really well maintained, high occupancy, high rates until the weekend hits. Friday and Saturday nights are slower, so the rates drop, bringing in not so savory folk. I have 2 stories that are good. This hotel is 100% pet friendly. Mostly, we get dogs, cats, birds, and occasionally snakes, lizard, and a few pot-bellied pigs. Now, to the shit show of a few weird nights working overnight. I came into work at 11 p.m, and it was a quiet Saturday night. I ploughed through all the paperwork, finished all my duties for the night, and was kicking back watching movies on my laptop. A guest comes to the desk, asking if we had a room with 2 beds available, the rate, and about our pet policy. I answered their questions and checked them in. The guests leave and said they were going bowling and that they would be back. A few hours later, at around 2 a.m, they call the front desk and ask for an extra robe and requesting me to deliver it, saying they'd make it worth my time. I asked the bellman to watch the desk and go to deliver the robe. I get to their room and knock on the door. The guests ask me to come back a few minutes later, so I go to smoke a cigarette and come back in around 10 minutes. I knock again and ask me to go away and come back after. I oblige, and as I'm walking away I hear a snorting sound. This sound was horrendous. It sounded like a pot-bellied pig. I am walking away thinking, what the hell is going on here? My bellman calls me on my walkie and asks if I called the fire department and an ambulance. I let him know I did not, and I'm walking back to the room. I drop the robe on the floor and knock and let them know I had an emergency to attend to. The guests fling the door open and frantically ask if I was the fire department. I look down the hall and see paramedics and firemen racing towards me. I look in the room and see a 250-pound woman in nothing but a robe and a red thong laying motionless on the floor. The woman is grey with foam coming out of her mouth. The pig noise was the woman fighting to breathe. I step inside the room and hold the door for the emergency personnel. They ask the couple inside what happened, and the couple respond that what had happened is that they met their friend in a bowling alley. They were celebrating a birthday and had too much to drink. Then their friend was too drunk to drive, so they came back to the hotel to let her sleep it off, and she just collapsed. They give the medics her name and as much information as they knew about her. By this time, the sheriffs arrived to escort the medics to a hospital. The sheriffs see the couple's story as bullshit and asks the medics to empty the woman's purse. What falls out is a pharmacy of pills and powders along with her ID, and piece together that this woman is a pill-popping prostitute. The couple confesses up that she was popping pills and drinking heavily all night. The medics cart the pale woman away, slid on the robe and the thong to a hospital. The sheriffs give the guests and myself the information on this woman for my report. The guests then stay in the room, watch about $100 worth in adult movies, have a huge breakfast in the morning, and check out late. We charge them for the robe. This second story is a fun one. An older gentleman walks to the front desk at midnight asking for a room. I give him the details and check in. He seems normal and quite cordial. The gentleman goes to the room, and a few hours later comes down to the front desk and asks me if I know where to score some ecstasy. I tell him no, and he storms off out the hotel, mumbling to himself, saying he wants to kill me. Now, I don't feel endangered by this guy. I have a weight and height advantage over him, and know how to handle myself thanks to training given to me by my ex-Marine brother. This guy comes back to the hotel a few hours later in a much better mood. Me, on the other hand, is scared shitless. He comes strolling in wearing a thick sheriff officer's jacket and a sheriff's hat, a la Carl from The Walking Dead. He asks me if I had a girlfriend, and I reply, yes, and he tells me to dump her because women are evil. He then tells me his story of heartbreak and revelation. This guy went to prison for beating his ex-wife in rage of finding out she'd cheated on him. He had a revelation whilst in prison. The best experience was making love to a man, and that women were the devil. The guy warns me to dump women and consider men. I apologize to him about how I'm straight and thank him for the story. He then walks away saying to consider it and not to knock it till I try it. Once he left, I call 911 and ask if anyone is missing a jacket and a hat. They say that they will check the on-duty officers and will call back. They call back and ask me if the person is staying at the hotel. I confirm with them his details and description. They inform me to keep away from him, that he took a brick to a window of a cruiser, as the officer was on his lunch break at a nearby diner just doing some paperwork at the table, and stole a taser, a jacket, hat and a club. A few minutes later, the hotel is surrounded. The officer asks for his room number and an override key. I provide them all the information and the officers race to the room. There, they find the guy watching adult movies and sodomizing himself with the club. They come out with the guy cuffed. He yells to me on the way out to reconsider his beliefs of women. Surprisingly, his credit card went through for all the charges. I started working at 3 a.m. at my job in a warehouse type store. The creepiest thing I dealt with was being a few minutes late for work and needing to walk from the far end of the pitch black parking lot to the door and wait to be let in. That was until I volunteered to do an overnight to watch the store when our security system was broken. The night started off with me coming in right before the store closed for the night. I got settled into the assembly area and started putting grills together. My manager said she was staying at the front end of the store for the night, so I knew I would be in the back alone. Our lights in the back are set up with motion sensors, so after about an hour or something, all of the lights went out. I was in a covered area that had its own light, so I paid no mind and continued working. Sometime later, all the lights came back on, and I assumed it was my manager walking back, so I sat and waited for a few minutes for her to make her way back to where I was. Nothing. I listened to see if I could hear footsteps. Nothing. So here I am, at the furthest point from the front door, and our security system isn't working, and only one other woman is in the store with me. My mind started spinning. I thought someone broke in, and they were going to find me alone in the back. That is how my life ends. After a minute, I gathered the courage to come out and walk towards the entrance from the store to the back end. As I stood there scanning the room and listening for someone, my manager comes walking in. I tell her what happened, and she told me that was the first time she came back all night. It definitely creeped me out. I decided I had enough of assembly for the night, and moved on to scanning products on the shelves. Now, parts of the store have some light, and others have almost none. I got to the selection that had very little light and continued scanning, still on edge from earlier. As I was walking down the aisle, I kept hearing a sort of tapping on metal, and then I heard flapping wings, like when a bird flies off. I realized then it was probably one of the many birds we have flying all over the store that set the light sensors off. Not dangerous, but definitely creepy, being in a dim warehouse overnight. Being a thick-skulled teen, overcharged with attitude, and a loose grasp of what I really should be doing, I butted heads with my father frequently. Nothing physical, beyond the type of fatigue that hits you about 2 hours after an argument, and the drop of Kool-Aid on the floor. I'm sure he meant well, but at the time I thought it was a bit excessive. At some point, we decided it's best to split company, and I went to the Job Corps, graduated and got real jobs, and reenacted the highlights of my previous years with my bosses playing the fall guy. It went as incredibly as you imagine. being on the other side of a fairly large state. And, out of work, I swallowed my pride and asked my father for assistance, a place to stay so that I could escape the land of everlasting cornfields and get back on my feet. Remember the pose monkey paw? Yeah, me too. A short month later, I still had no job, despite actively applying and being on the delayed entry program for the military, and was on day 3 of the 3 days, no job in 3 days, you gotta go ultimatum. So, where does one go when you have no job, no place to stay, and don't know anyone in the state? You walk the streets because you have no car. I'm walking down one of the main streets in Arizona in the winter. Being night is also bloody cold, so I'm decked out in my traditional hope no one notices me wear all black with black trench coat, and I'm walking towards the local gas station to make use of the change I've accrued for my nightly meal, a 99-cent burger. And some random, scantily club-clothed lady walks past me, heading in the opposite direction. About 10 feet past me, she says, "Hey, can you do me a favor?" Odd, but okay, I'll bite. Depends. Can you walk with me?" she says. "It's a few blocks to my house, but I really don't want to walk alone." Once again, odd, but I'll bite. "Yeah, I suppose." We start walking, and now I'm kind of on edge. This could be bait to mess me up and take my coat or something. Or she got into an argument with her man who's going to show up and pull a gun on me. Either way, I'm waiting for the other foot to drop. As we walk, a few cars past, mostly police cars. I'm not thinking anything of it, because I'd been stopped 7 times that night by random cops, saying I fit the look of someone who pulled a stunt in town somewhere. After about 4 blocks of walking, she just says, "Thank you," and dips down a side street. Okay, no biggie. Girl hadn't said 2 words to me the whole walk, so now I double back thinking, screw it, I didn't get robbed or jumped, and the burger spot is 24 hours. After about 5 blocks, I was 2 away from the burger spot, I'd seen a couple more cop cars drive past, and all towards the burger spot with their lights on. Yeah, hot dogs for 99 cents it is. I head across the street and hit the gas station, while paying for my hot dogs. I tell the clerk, I guess the cops were seriously hungry. The dude with a cold look looks at me in the face and says, "Nah, someone flipped out and shot the place up about 20 or so minutes ago." I just blink. About 20 minutes ago, I would have been sitting in that burger joint if it weren't for that random girl. Whoever or wherever you are, thanks, and I'm glad we got home safely. I worked janitorial and maintenance services at a local YMCA when I was in college. It was a brand new facility. Everything was modern and technological. All lights were motion activated to conserve energy. Every hallway had excellent camera security with audio, and a control room of sorts, nicknamed the Cave, that fed all the streams to a couple of monitors and housed the building's servers and sound systems. Every year, we would have a week-long shutdown, which basically entailed all hands on deck to deep clean the entire facility. We'd do stupid shit to keep morale up. At some point, whilst bleaching pool grates, in large 50-gallon trash cans for example, I had to get naked and dump out the bleach water as to not ruin my clothes. My best friend would set up ridiculous games she would invent in the gym, with all the cool equipment they got. Most importantly, we'd all get buzzed as hell on energy drinks, and we were allowed to drink alcohol if we wanted to, so long as we weren't handling heavy equipment or highly toxic chemicals. So basically, when we were doing mundane duties like mopping or scrubbing grout, these shifts sometimes lasted 18 to 20 hours, because we were all broke and needed money, and it was kind of fun in between all the bitching and moaning, the stupid tasks we were given from time to time. One night, we finished the pools and moved into the office. There wasn't much technical shit to do there, mostly just scrubbing walls and extracting the carpets and dusting machines. As such, we designated it to a chill night and brought some beer to keep the party going. All doors were propped open, including the cave door. It was well into the night, and our boss ordered us pizza. So everyone is taking a break and sitting in the common area of the office, cleared out for carpet extraction. I hear my best friend go, "Nope," and then we follow her eyes to the cave, and the security camera screens are flashing brighter one by one. We realise we're watching a Zamboni tile scrubber drive itself up the hall and crashing right into the racquetball court glass wall. That's not the creepy part, because if you've ever operated a Zamboni, you know it weighs almost a ton, and therefore when it's switched on, it has power wheels to assist in pushing the monster around. We're all dreading having to go clean up the mess, as at the result of the glass, and not so subtly making plans to murder the idiot that left it on. That's when it gets creepy. Remember how I mentioned our super fancy camera security system had audio recording? A voice whispers over the monitor, "I'm sorry." No voice we immediately recognize, and then we realize that we're all in the office, on the opposite side of the building, every one of us, and we have been for almost an hour, and we had finished the pool deck already. There was no reason to even have the Zamboni out since closing up the night before, and we designated that night as an alcohol night, and everyone promised not to touch heavy equipment. If this was one of our own, they would legit own up. Whoever left the Zamboni though never confessed, and we were a tight-knit group, and word usually got around eventually. We're convinced it was something supernatural. I delivered papers overnight with my grandmother for a few months. We'd leave our house at 11 p.m, get to the paper warehouse at 11:30, wait for the truck with the papers to show up, bag them, and then go out and deliver them until 4 or 5 in the morning. So this involves driving down roads in my town in the dead of night. There are a few times I nearly shit myself. There was a private community down a dirt road off a not so busy street. It was in the middle of the woods, or it at least felt like it. Slender, the 8 pages, had just come out. So thick trees and forest weren't a great thing to drive into at 3 in the morning. This private community had a line of around 15 to 20 mailboxes, with slots underneath for the paper to go in. Normally, if it were a house, you'd throw the paper on the porch or the driveway and call it a day. Since these were individual slots, I had to get out of the car with 15 papers and put them in each slot, and then get back in the car. I'm in the process of doing this one morning, at probably 4 a.m, going down the line of mailboxes, when I hear, "What are you doing?" in a gruff, grumpy old voice. I promptly jumped out of my skin and said, "Delivering papers?" This old twat steps out from behind the mailboxes with his dog and says, "You're late," and sticks his hand out for a paper. I finished putting all the papers in each mailbox slot in front of him and got back in the car. Never handed him a paper, since I wasn't going to know which number house he was. We backed up, did a 3-point turn, and left. All the while, this guy was staring at us. Screw that guy. Charlie was a train hobo. The old school sort who would abide by and chide people over hobo law. Charlie lived in the hotel, now a condemned abandoned space, over my former kitchen of half a decade for a few years in the 1950s, faking paperwork and excuses for being a blatant draft dodger. To quote Charlie, he was a resourceful rascal that no damn jail knew what to do with. The VA feeds me the same, even if I only ever earned it on my knees. I'll say it now. His legend may loom because we only heard it from him and a few other hobos who stopped nearby. My first interaction with Charlie, I was probably 20, and he had to be around 80 to 82. He instantly embraced me as a dyke, although I'm not. I have a mohawk, so fair enough, and started regaling me with tales of being a gentleman to the ladies and having a great love for gays. Yes, he was a colourful character, but full of solid advice. Do not make promises unless you planned to spend a life with the person you made promises to. It didn't matter if the promise was the loan of a nickel or to love someone forever. Promises are a currency you don't take lightly. That's Charlie talk. He frequently chastised the boys at work for showing up hungover, unkept. This is some goddamn hobo who often was just out of a night in the drunk tank. He would frequently fake drunk for a place to sleep overnight, lecturing young strapping boys how to come correct in behaviour and presentation. Since our kitchen door led right to the sidewalk, Charlie often bought us gifts like chairs or fans, or anything that would stave off the 130-degree heat during the summers. We had many bums who would come up to our window, and we knew many of them by name. None of them would ever be so polite or interesting or charming as Charlie Potatoes. So here's what it is really. One night, I was closing with my good friend in the kitchen. Charlie showed up at the kitchen window later than usual, and I asked if he wanted his typical bum box. A few kinds of meat, red beans and rice, cooked vegetables. And he kind of stared glassy-eyed and said no. I went out for a smoke for a few minutes, and later Charlie was still out there. I realised he was wearing a suit with a skinny tie. It fit oddly but was worn. So, Charlie, I realised he'd put out one of his hidey-hos somewhere. He had them in spaces all over the city, and I asked him, "Hey Charlie, you sure you don't want anything to eat?" At this point, he was standing at the edge of our sidewalk, staring into a street lamp. "No, girly girl, you know what I mean, what I say. I don't need food tonight." "Charlie, are you okay?" I was responded with silence. I almost walked towards him to shake him. Shit, I knew him for years and never touched him, because I assumed he was drunk, and he said, No. Then he turned really slowly and looked at me in the eyes on the verge of tears and said, "You just tell them pretty closeted gay boys that I'm thankful for everything, and thank you." Then he stiff-legged and he walked off. Another local bum, Wingnut, told us the next day that Charlie had died about an hour later. Here's where I'd get philosophical, even close to awake. Suffice to say that Charlie's dying was really hard for me, and I assume worse for him. He's legendary to numerous people, but never had the stability to write it down. He'd never had the family support to pass on. He just had a bunch of punk asses in a pirate kitchen to listen to his mythos, and an alleyway in an old suit to die in on an empty stomach. Shit. So there you go. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's video. If you did, please remember to give the video a big thumbs up and consider subscribing and hit the little bell icon for even more stories every day. As I said in yesterday's video, I have made a brand new selection of playlists to entertain you endlessly that will also be updated frequently with many of your favourite topics. Why not check them out? You'll be able to find all of them on the main page. Don't forget that if you would like me to read a story on my channel, feel free to send it to my email, or alternatively share it to my Reddit, which is of course available in the description. Please make sure to include as much punctuation and description as possible, as well as paragraphs, to maximize the chances of it being read. But anyway, for now guys, I'm gonna sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.